Hey friends, so if you're like me, every once in a while when you're either working on a new poi pattern or you're trying to imagine a new poi pattern, you really want to think of what's the perfect version of this and how close am I to getting that? One of my favorite tools for figuring this out is using Adobe After Effects to create simulations of different poi patterns, and today I'm going to guide you through how I do that. Drex here from drexfactor.com, and today we are drilling down how to create poi animations in Adobe After Effects. Please sign up to join my notification squad by clicking on the subscribe button as well as the notification bell. That way you'll know exactly when I drop a new video. Before we dive in, I just want to give a shout out to the friends of the channel. Big thanks to Dark Monk, Flowtoys, LMF Props, Spinballs, and Ultrapoi for helping to make the videos on this channel possible. You can visit them all by following the links down in the description of this video. So real quickly before we start, let's talk about what types of poi tricks are an ideal fit for this style of simulation and which are not such a good fit. Being as how all these simulations are happening in a two-dimensional environment, the best fit for them are two-dimensional poi tricks. That is, any kinds of flower moves, including gunslingers, caps, you name it. On the other hand, anything that requires 3 dimensions is not going to be a good fit for this. Examples include things like weaves, body tracers, and probably contact moves and throws as well. Now, it is possible that you could find ways of modeling contact poi tricks in this, but it would require a lot of steps, be very difficult, and probably not look very good. So with that in mind, I'm going to drill down how this technique works. So let's move over to the big screen now, yeah? Cool, so I have open Adobe After Effects, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and open up a new composition. Now, this composition I'm going to have be approximately 12 seconds long, which is probably longer than I actually need it to be, but it'll be fine for our purposes right now. And I'm going to hit OK. Now, the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to add a shape layer. So I go up here to Layer, New, and Shape Layer. Now, what I want to add to this shape layer is going to be a circle. So I go up here to the ellipse tool, and I'm just going to go ahead and create myself an ellipse. Now, my composition here is scaled to the window, so I want to make sure that this circle here is going to be no more than 1/3 the distance across my poi pattern. You'll see why in a second here. So now that I've created this, I'm going to go ahead and set the center of it to red. There's really no good reason for this other than just the fact that I'm feeling like doing it right now. And I don't understand why it didn't change. There we go. Much better. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go down here to Contents and Ellipse 1 and Transform Ellipse 1. And I'm going to set the position at 0, 0, which means that this circle is now centered in my composition. All right? Now, my next mission is to go up here to Layer and New and create a new null object. Now, a null object in After Effects is basically something that's invisible but moves around and kind of acts like a guide for something else. You'll see what this is doing in just a second here. So my null object, I'm going to come down here to my composition window and the transform, and I am going to move I think it's the position I want to move. Nope, it is the anchor point. So I want to change the Y value on the anchor point. And notice how that little crosshair is there, which is the anchor to this shape, isn't moving, but the rectangle that is the null object is. The top left corner of the null object is what we are really concerned about here. So I'm going to move that up the Y-axis until it's basically right sitting there on the edge of the circle. Yeah? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hit that little stopwatch right next to rotation here, right at the beginning of the composition, and then I'm going to move over here to the 1 second line. And now I'm going to hit this little diamond here. Now what I've done is I've just added 2 keyframes for my null object right here. And I'm at this position at 1 second right here, where what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this first number where it says X to 1. That means that it has completed 1 rotation by the time it gets to the second keyframe. By the way, if you are new to Adobe After Effects and have no idea what keyframes are, I highly recommend looking up some tutorials on this. The ones that I used were from a website called Video Copilot. And it's very good at introducing you to some of the basics, including keyframing, which is super important. Cool, so now that I've done that, I'm gonna scroll back and forth in the timeline right here, and what you're gonna notice is that that null object, that kind of invisible square here, now rotates around that circle just once here. Pretty cool, huh? Well, my next step now is going to be create something that is actually visible. So I'm going to go back up here to layer, and I'm going to create a new shape layer. I've already got a shape layer, but I want a second one, all right? And this is where I'm going to create the animated simulated version of my poi. So I'm going to start off by just creating a little poi head by using the ellipse tool one more time, and I'm going to hold down the shift button to make sure that it is a perfect circle. And it doesn't have to be terribly big, that'll do. And now I'm gonna come back up here to my shape tool and switch over to using a rectangle. And for this rectangle, what I'm actually creating here is the tether of the poi. So I'm gonna create it such that it comes up just barely here to the bottom of my ellipse. And I'm going to change the fill to white to make it clear that that is meant to be a tether. Now I'm going to come over here, and under the rectangle, I'm going to hit transform, and I'm going to switch the x coordinate to 0, which is going to bring it to my center line. I'm going to do the same thing here for my ellipse. I am going to bring the x coordinate to 0. And I'm also going to change my y coordinate here so that it's just at the very, very edge of that tether / rectangle, yeah? Cool. Now I have my poi intact and it's on the center line, so I'm going to start moving it as a complete unit. That means instead of contents, I'm going to be down here where it says transform. So down here under transform, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the anchor point, which you can see it is still anchored on that crosshair that's in the middle of the composition here. And I'm going to move it until the end of the tether is right in the middle of that crosshairs. Now I'm going to come down here to position, and I'm going to change the y coordinate on the position. I'm going to bring it up. So you see how the crosshair right at the end of the poi is now moving with the poi? So now I bring it up to the very edge of the circle, yeah? And I'm going to do something kind of interesting here. I am going to take my second shape layer here, and I'm going to turn the parent into my null object. How I do that is either I click right here on this little drop down and I click null 1, or I can click on this little spiral here and drag it down to the null object, and it'll do the same bunch of business. So now, as I go around the timeline to 1 second, check it out. My poi is now moving around with the null object. So you can think of the null object here as being like my hand. It's invisible right now, but it does the job, right? So I no longer need the circle that I started with, because this was really just a guide to basically figure out what circle the poi was going to move around as it was kind of simulating a movement. You can think of that circle as being the movement of the hand, but I don't want to make the hand visible. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to get us to a total of 4 rotations here. So we've got some time to work with. Going to take it out to 4 seconds. And now I'm going to go back through the keyframes. So remember, my keyframe at 1 second was for 1 rotation. And my keyframe at 2 seconds is going to be 2 rotations. My keyframe at 3 seconds is going to be 3 rotations. And my keyframe at 4 seconds is going to be 4 rotations. So now I have 4 rotations of the poi spinning around this invisible hand circle here, yeah? So I can just show you the preview, and we've got 4 circles. Lovely, yeah? Right now it's just repeating between the beginning and 4 seconds because I shortened up my workspace to there. Cool, that's great. It is moving very rapidly, so I'm actually going to make it so that it's completing a rotation every 2 seconds instead of every 1 second. So I'm just gonna move my keyframes here to make that happen. And that's one of the beautiful things about the keyframes is that it's very easy to make quick adjustments to your animation using them. And once again, cool. That seems like a good speed to me. Fabulous. So now we have the poi moving around this hand circle. We can think of this as being like an extension. So what do we do now with it? What if, say, I wanted to model an anti-spin flower? Well, notice here that under rotation for the null object, whenever I add something to this first value, that is the number of rotations that I've done, it's always a positive number, right? Well, we're going to go ahead up here to our shape layer and drop down the transform, and we're going to go ahead and add ourselves some keyframes here. So we're going to start at 0, of course, and then I'm going to hop out to 2 seconds because that is where our first hand circle completes, and I'm going to add another keyframe. And I am going to set the rotation to -4x. That means that for every 1 rotation that the hand does, the poi relative to the hand is going to do -4 turns. And the result of that is going to be a 4-petal anti-spin flower. Cool, huh? So I'm going to go ahead and jump out here and fill out the rest of the keyframes so you can see this in action repeatedly. So for the second set of keyframes, it's going to be -8. For the third, it's going to be -12. And for this last keyframe out here, it is going to be -16. Because we have to do 4 rotations of the poi for every 1 rotation that the hand does, yeah? And as you'll see, I now have a repeating animation where my poi is doing a 4-petal anti-spin flower. Pretty neat, right? So there's actually more that we can do with this. And make sure, yep, okay, cool. So one thing that we can do here is we can actually add trails to our poi. And because I think it looks kind of janky to like have it jumping around like this and everything, I want to add some motion blur to our poi here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here to layer, and I'm going to add a new adjustment layer. And this adjustment layer, I'm going to add a new effect to, which is called Echo. I'm going to drag Echo over to that adjustment layer. And for those of you guys who've seen my video on using Premiere to create trails on glow footage, you'll know that what's coming up here is that we are going to use the echo to add some trails to our poi here. So I'm not going to mess with the echo time. It should be -0.033 because that's what it is for our frame right here. I'm going to set our number of echoes to like 20 and the decay to 0.8. and the echo operator to maximum. And it's going to take a second to render this for us, but check it out. Now you're going to see some echoes of our poi as it goes around. Pretty cool, huh? And of course, if I want to, I can change what the poi is doing. Maybe instead of a 4-petal anti-spin flower, I instead would like to have a 3-petal anti-spin flower, like a triquetra. So what I do here is, at the conclusion of that first repetition around, instead of it being -4, it's going to be -3 because there are 3 petals to a triquetra. So it becomes -3, -6, -9, and -12. Because those are the multiples of 3, right? So sure enough, got 1 triquetra, 2 triquetra, 3 triquetra, 4 triquetra. Sweet. And the great thing about this is we're using the built-in rotation functions on After Effects to create this. So for all intents and purposes, it is as close to perfect as we can possibly get for this, right? you can basically come up with any flower that you would want to out of this one. I'm going to try one more thing right quick, just because I don't like the appearance of how we're getting these kind of gaps in the trails here, and that is that. I'm going to try and see if I can add a motion blur to this. Yes, here we go. So the next effect we're going to add here is CC, Force Motion Blur, excuse me. We're going to drag that over to our adjustment layer. And the thing that you need to know about this is where it says shutter. Well, so for blur samples, I usually grab about 18, and there's no reason for that really. It was just the number that I was taught as I was learning how to use After Effects. And for shutter angle, I'm going to set it to 360 because that creates a continuous motion blur. And now you will notice there are no gaps in our trails, and it's awesome. So this is going to take just a second to render, but let's run it through and let it preview this for us, yeah? So now we have this beautiful and very, very smooth set of trails coming off of our pattern. And if we wanted to, we could make a copy of our shape layer 2 here and add a second poi that is doing something different very, very easily. I'm gonna give it just a second to catch up to us here so you can see the full animation. And actually, now that I think about it, I am just going to cut to showing you guys the full animation of it doing the triquetra here and everything, so you can see that in action and understand what we're trying to get to here, yeah? Cool, so you may be asking yourself, how do I figure out the math of creating more patterns like this? And the answer to that is that I actually wrote a math paper a few years ago on how to model different poi patterns using trigonometry. It's a little bit different in this case because we are using polar rather than Cartesian coordinates. But if you understand the basics of how many petals there are and everything, then it's the knowledge just transfers straight across. And you can download that paper at a link that I'm going to leave in the description of this video here. Cool, so I hope this was helpful, and I would love to see some of the patterns that you guys are going to model using this technique. So if you go ahead and create any, please post them to Instagram and use the hashtag DrexFactorPoi so I can check them out, because that would be lovely. Before we sign off here, I'm just going to put out a massive thank you to all of my awesome supporters on Patreon, because it is you guys that make these videos possible and make it possible for me to keep on producing my channel. So if you love the content that you're seeing and you would like to sign up to support it, please head on over to patreon.com/DrexFactorPoi. So if you dug this video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel by clicking up here. Over here are some other videos that you may enjoy, including a playlist of videos that are just like the one that you just watched. Finally, if you enjoy the work that I do and would like to sign up to support it on Patreon, you can do so by clicking down here or by heading over to patreon.com/DrexFactorPoi. Thanks in advance, and peace.